If you asked a lot of people who have lived in Moorton for any extended period of time who Chalky is, they would probably be able to give you an answer. Depending upon what that answer is, they might shudder first. One answer would be that he was the character that the old ball pit and jungle gym place used to have. Chalky Chimp was usually some local teenager dressed up in a natty old animal suit that looked nothing like a chimp, so that he could host the parties and jump around acting the fool in the ball pit with the kids. Other people will tell you that Chalky Chimp was one of the characters you would see at the Moorton Heritage Weekend, a big Victorian fete held once a year where local people set up stalls and turn up in period costumes. Chalky was a kind of bear or monkey thing that would walk around amongst the crowds handing out sweets and playing with the children, despite the fact that no vendor or member of the community had registered or volunteered to be Chalky on that or any other year. Of course, there's also the other stories. For many years, Chalky was something of a spook story that parents in Moorton would tell their children. There are records of nannies and even teachers using Chalky as a sort of bogeyman, warning kids not to go near the abandoned storerooms up at the mills because Chalky liked to hide there, or to stay away from the railway bridge and tunnels because that's where Chalky hunts. In those stories, Chalky was some kind of half-man, half-animal, with huge bulging eyes and a mouth full of sharp triangular teeth, rimmed with bright red lips. How this thing somehow managed to be a figure of children's entertainment, and also some kind of terrifying monster, was always a mystery to me, right up until a few years ago, when I had my own strange experience with the fabled Chalky suit. I had discovered it amongst the donations for a charity raffle, and having realised it was of some age, had gotten in touch with my friend Archie Tanner, the curator of the Moorton Heritage Centre. He knew immediately what the suit was and even went on to show me photographs of someone wearing the suit at village fairs as far back as 1896, though as he explained, he suspected the suit to be far older than that. He also explained that the suit was not originally intended to depict a monkey or ape at all, but probably some kind of demon or devil in local mystery plays. He also related the history of how Chalky had been a fear of local children for decades. Perhaps it was hearing those final details that put strange ideas in my head and made me see things that were not really there. But later that evening I returned to the Moorton Victoria Library where I had been arranging the charity donations, and in the quiet of an upstairs room I saw what I thought was the Chalky suit propped up in an old chair in the corner of the room. What immediately creeped me out about this vision, however, was not the suit itself, but the fact that someone seemed to be wearing it. I rushed from the room and out of the library altogether. By the time I returned, the suit, along with whoever had been wearing it, was missing. I would have looked for it at the Heritage Weekend to see if someone turned up to walk amongst the crowds in that hideous outfit as they had in previous years, but during the pandemic the event was cancelled, and last year the big storms prevented the thing from going ahead. I'll be honest and say that for a long time, despite how creepy that experience was, I pretty much forgot about Chalky. That was until around 2 weeks ago when my old friend Archie called and asked me to meet him at the Ivy Leaf pub because, in his words, he had something he needed to talk to me about. When I arrived at the pub, I was surprised to find that Archie wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was Mike Doyle, the head of the local police department and a guy affectionately referred to locally as Sheriff, though no such title actually existed. The two men were conversing quietly, and when I walked into the bar, they both turned to look at me. To say that someone looked as if they had seen a ghost is an overused expression, but it's the one that fits. In fact, not only did they each look as if they'd seen a ghost, but as if they had seen the same one. I took up my seat and asked what the matter was. The answer was a single word: Chalky. Around 3 hours before Archie had called me, Mike had been standing at the scene of what appeared to be both a road traffic accident and quite possibly a kidnapping. As he explained the situation, I could almost imagine the blur of blue flashing lights on that quiet road out of town leading up to the cemetery on the hill. When the call had come in, he said, it was difficult to work out exactly what had happened. The only thing that was clear was that the person on the other end of the phone was begging for an ambulance and screaming insensibly. From the few scraps of sense that he was able to extract from her, Mike picked out 2 phrases that were enough to convince him he needed to get the location fast. One phrase repeated over and over was, "He was going to hurt her." The other was, "I think I've killed him." 15 minutes later, after having finally wrestled an accurate location out of the woman, Mike arrived at the cemetery road to find an ambulance already parked up. As he got out of his car, 2 paramedics were already loading what looked at first glance like an animal onto a stretcher and lifting it into the ambulance. Only after closer inspection did it become clear that the injured party was in fact someone wearing a costume, or in Mike's words, a big ape suit. Hearing those words sent a hideous shiver like a line of ice-cold ants scurrying up my spine. Memories of that suit, that full and occupied suit sitting quietly in the corner and watching me. Those big blue eyes, circular, wide and mad. The row of triangular teeth jutted forward as it silently waited and watched.
They tried getting the mask off, but it was stuck on like someone had glued it, so they just lifted the fella into the ambulance. I went over to talk to the woman who had called and she was in tears. Apparently the lad in the suit was going in the ambulance, but the kiddie...
I jumped in to interrupt. "Kid? What kid? You didn't mention a kid."
Because she wasn't there, she'd already been bundled into another car with a paramedic and driven off to hospital. They, the paramedics I mean, they didn't want her having to share an ambulance with the fella in the animal suit.
"Was the kid hurt too?" I asked, confused as to what had actually gone on up at the road.
"Yeah,"
Mike said, shaking his slowly.
"But not as badly. It breaks down like this." The woman who rang me was driving over the tops past the cemetery on her way out of town. As she was driving up, she noticed 2 people on the side of the road. A little girl and a man holding her hand and wearing a full animal suit, head to toe covered up. She said she vaguely recognized the suit, but what creeped her out was that the girl didn't look like she was going with the man willingly. From what she could see, it looked like she was being pretty much dragged up the road.
Again, a cold flash along the spine as my insides began to tighten.
She said she slowed down a bit as she passed them to get a better look. It seemed funny to her. Why would anyone be wearing that kind of outfit that far out, going up toward the moors? I mean, surely you'd at least take the mask part off. And the girl was sobbing and pulling against him. She says she thought it looked odd, but she didn't want to intervene in case it was just someone's granddaughter throwing a tantrum or something, so she passed them and kept on driving.
What happened next was related to me that night by Mike, but in the weeks after the incident I heard it directly from the horse's mouth. It turned out the woman in question was a friend of mine named Margaret Evans. She said that as she drove by she couldn't help looking back in the rearview mirror, but what she saw made her slam her brakes.
"He'd stopped,"
she said,
"at the side of the road. I don't know if he thought I could see him or not, but for some reason he stopped just at that moment and he bent forward, lowering his head as if he was going to whisper something to her or kiss her on the cheek or something. He had one hand on her wrist and the other on the tip of her chin, and he seemed to be forcing her mouth open as if he was going to check her teeth. I could imagine him saying, 'Say ah,' because her mouth opened up, but then..."
I remember she hesitated and swallowed hard before continuing.
"He bent down really quickly and well. He bit her tongue, as the teeth of the mask bit her, but it must have been his teeth behind because her tongue came right out of her mouth, all long and pink and stretched upwards. He was biting one end, and with his hand he sort of grasped it and started yanking and pulling. She was screaming as best she could, and I saw blood. The tongue was coming up, longer than it should have been, as if it had snapped from its moorings or tendons and was being dragged right out of her. It stretched upward for inches. He was hurting her. It was clear as day that he was hurting her. I screamed out of the window for him to stop, but when he didn't, I didn't know what to do, so I put the car in reverse and, well, I ran him over."
Margaret ploughed her car into the man in the chalky suit, sending him spinning into a crumpled heap by the side of the road and narrowly missing the little girl. She then leaped from her car and called the police.
"By the time I got there,"
Mike said,
the girl had already been taken to hospital. Apparently she's got some serious damage to her tongue, where the bastard tried to wrench it out, and big chunks taken out where he'd started chewing it.
He brought his drink to his lips with some difficulty, and I could see as he did that his hand was shaking violently.
I was getting the basics of the story from the woman When I heard screaming from inside the ambulance, I ran over to see what had happened, and there it was, just an empty, crumpled-up suit laying there on the stretcher. I asked them where he'd gone, and they insisted he hadn't gone anywhere. 1 second he was there, and the next, the suit had nobody in it. It was just a pile of empty fabric and fur.
You will be pleased to know that the young girl in question made a full recovery, at least physically, though her mother says she still wakes up in the night screaming about Chalky. 4 paramedics from the scene and Margaret all swore that they had seen a man in a costume be loaded onto the stretcher. The same people also swore that there was no way he could have escaped. Yet all that remained 10 minutes later was a natty old costume meant to be some kind of animal or monster. The suit, meanwhile, was taken into the care of Archie, custodian of the Heritage Centre. It now sits in a heavily locked wooden trunk in the back room of the centre. Archie says that he hasn't opened that box since the day he put the tatty old thing in there. Not because he's scared of the suit itself, but because he's scared that when he opens the trunk next time, there may be nothing inside.